Hello and welcome to Cleveland Classic Cinema. Tonight's movie is 1946's The Stranger, directed by Orson Welles. Near the end of World War II, the Nazis' knew defeat was on the horizon, and many of the upper-level officers began making plans for after the war, using the fortunes they'd stolen from civilians, mostly Jews. They manufactured false identities, planned escape routes, and disappeared before they could be captured. Some are still being hunted to this day. Most of the major ones, or at least the more infamous ones, have been captured or run to ground, like Adolf Eichmann or Joseph Mengele. Some are still out there, hiding as respectable citizens right here in the U.S., or living out what's left of their worthless lives in South America. Speaking personally, I think they should all be rounded up and shot. The Nazis committed crimes against humanity that, at least at the time, were unimaginable. There's still a number of idiots that deny the Holocaust ever happened, but that's a discussion for another show. The Stranger is a movie that deals with the subject of Nazi hunting, and to be honest, the story has similarities to Alfred Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, but it has the stamp of Orson Welles all over it. This is considered one of Welles' minor films, so it hasn't been dissected as heavily as Citizen Kane or The Lady from Shanghai. As a matter of fact, there's barely anything to be found about the making of this film anywhere. Welles himself admitted more than once that he did this movie for the money, and also to prove that he could work within the studio system, bringing it in on time and on budget, so most people tend to ignore it. If you're familiar with his style, however, it's all over the movie. The low-angle shots and long takes he used in Citizen Kane are here, along with some scenes shot in silhouette, and there's one scene in particular that I think is excellent. It takes place at the dinner table when Franz Kindler, the character played by Welles, and Wilson, the Nazi hunter played by Edward G. Robinson, face off against each other about Nazi philosophy. Wilson begins slowly and needles Kindler until his facade begins to slip, and then he goes into a bit of a rant but pulls back when he realizes what he's saying. From that moment on, however, there's no doubt between the two of them exactly what's going on at that table. Welles was always great at playing bad guys. I mean, all you have to do is look at him during this scene and you can see the relish he has for the role in his eyes. And he doesn't disappoint here. Before I go on, let me tell you a bit about something Welles did back in the 1930s that focused the attention of not only Hollywood, but the entire country on him. I'm talking about the infamous War of the Worlds radio broadcast of October 1938. And to understand how something like this could have happened, you have to know what life was like in 1938. There was no television, there was only radio, and that was only about 10 years old at the time. Before that, information was spread either by newspapers or word of mouth. The fact that a piece of furniture could give you up-to-the-date information as quickly as you could dial it in was still a new idea. And the fact that it came to the listener live from all over the world was amazing. For the first time in history, people could hear news as it happened instead of afterwards. And in the late 1930s, there was some scary stuff going on. Hitler was steamrolling across Europe, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before this country got dragged into the conflict. At the time, America was an isolationist country. After the horror of World War I, the country, still mired in the Depression, had adapted a go on about your business and leave us out of it attitude towards the rest of the world. We had our own problems to deal with after all, and Europe was half a world away. No one wanted a war on top of everything else, but they got one on October 31st of that year. Orson Welles was already well known to radio listeners as the voice of the Shadow and as the director of the Mercury Theater on the air. The Mercury Theater consisted of a cast of excellent actors handpicked by Welles himself, and they specialized in adapting classic stories such as The Count of Monte Cristo and Dracula to radio dramas, and were enjoying modest success. Unfortunately, they were on against Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, the most popular radio show in the country. Welles wanted to do something special for the Halloween show that year and settled on an adaptation of H.G. Wells' story, The War of the Worlds. Instead of using the original Victorian-era setting, however, he decided to update the story to present-day America. He and his co-writer, Howard Koch, started working on the script, and Koch, trying to figure out where to start the invasion, closed his eyes and stuck a pencil into a map of the tri-state area he purchased at a roadside gas station. It's stuck in a small town named Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and Koch felt that it was perfect. It sounded small-townish and was close enough to New York City to put it within striking distance. Using this spot as a jumping-off point, he plotted the advance of the Martians into New York City. Welles and Koch decided to tell the story in a series of news flashes to add realism in the first half, and in the second half went to traditional narration to relate the rest of the story. Then President Franklin D. Roosevelt often took to the radio to talk to the nation in what he called the fireside chats. These were messages that were kind of like the State of the Union address, but with a more folksy touch. Roosevelt was a master at talking to the nation and making it sound as if he were talking to every individual listening, and he was loved by just about everyone. Welles and Koch included a message supposedly from him, although the actor playing Roosevelt was announced as the Secretary of the Interior, since the management of CBS wouldn't allow him to say it was the president. And this added even more verisimilitude to the program. Now, if you listen to the show from the beginning, you knew exactly what was going on. They announced the story, Welles introduced it, and it began with a simulated radio broadcast of the music of Roman Rochello and his orchestra from the Meridian Room in the Park Plaza Hotel, located in New York City, playing La Composita. This was then interrupted by the first of a series of special reports outlining the crash of a meteor on a farm in nearby Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and the story began. Now the problem here is that an estimated 50% plus of the country missed all of this introductory stuff because they were listening to the Charlie McCarthy show. About 5 minutes in, a not too popular singer began performing, and those listening switched over to CBS, where they heard this.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Ramon Rochello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
This naturally caught their attention, so they kept listening instead of tuning back to Charlie McCarthy, and soon they heard this.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the latest bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. Toronto, Canada. Professor Morse of Macmillan University reports observing a total of 3 explosions on the planet Mars between the hours of 7:45 p.m. and 9:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This confirms earlier reports received from American observatories. Now, nearer home, comes a special bulletin from Trenton, New Jersey. It is reported that at 8:50 p.m. a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton. The flash in the sky was visible within a radius of several hundred miles, and the noise of the impact was heard as far north as Elizabeth. We have dispatched a special mobile unit to the scene, and we'll have our commentator, Carl Phillips, give you a word picture of the scene as soon as he can reach there from Princeton. In the meantime, we take you to the Hotel Martinet in Brooklyn, where Bobby Millett and his orchestra are offering a program of dance music.
Now think about this. For most of your life, you found out about breaking news 1 day to a week after it took place. And now you're hearing Hans van Kaltenborn broadcasting the sounds of the Spanish Civil War right into your living room. This is nothing short of miraculous. For the first time in history, you actually find out what's going on as it happens. And then you hear this.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmouth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmot's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Oh, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object, while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror that leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. The whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity. In the meantime, we have a late bulletin from San Diego, California. Professor Indelkoffer, speaking at a dinner of the California Astronomical Society, expressed the opinion that the explosions on Mars are undoubtedly nothing more than severe volcanic disturbances on the surface of the planet. We continue now with our piano interlude.
Well, all over New Jersey and parts of New York, as well as in other parts of the country, people were completely freaking out. The Trenton, New Jersey police logs for that night recorded dozens of calls from panicked citizens demanding protection, safe escort out of town, gas masks, what the number of casualties were, and where they could go to fight. People were running out onto the streets with wet cloths tied over their faces to guard against the gas attacks. One woman tried to commit suicide by taking poison, shrieking, "I'd rather die like this than like that." Her husband managed to wrest the bottle out of her hand before it was too late. One report had it that a group of farmers armed with shotguns had blasted holes in a water tower thinking it was a Martian war machine. Midway through the broadcast, the police came to the CBS studios and forced Welles to interrupt the show and announce to the audience that they were listening to a work of fiction. By that time, however, most of the people panicking weren't anywhere near a radio to hear this, so it didn't do much good. After the show was over, the police took Welles and co-director John Houseman into protective custody since they were being threatened with bodily harm by unamused listeners. The next morning, the show was front page news and the Mercury Theater on the air was the best-known radio show in the country. Soon after, Welles and his cast were on their way to Hollywood. George Orson Welles was born on May 6, 1915 in Kenosha, Wisconsin. He and his mother moved to Chicago when he was about 4 years old, and he developed a wanderlust early in life. By the age of 18, he had found success in Ireland working with the experimental Gate Theater and made his Broadway debut playing Tybalt in Romeo and Juliet at the age of 19. After meeting director-producer John Houseman, the two worked in the New York Federal Theater project, producing an all-black version of Macbeth, which was a rousing success. They eventually formed their own company, dubbing it the Mercury Theater, staging a version of Julius Caesar in 1937. Welles rewrote the play, setting it in fascist Italy. CBS eventually hired the entire company to stage hour-long radio plays, and Welles once again pushed the boundaries of the medium, building up to his War of the Worlds broadcast. RKO Radio Pictures brought Welles to Hollywood and gave him a deal to write, produce, direct, and act in 2 pictures, paying him $225,000, a percentage of the profits, and final cut of the picture, which was absolutely unheard of at the time. He cast about for a story attempting to adapt Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, before finally settling on a story he originally called American and eventually titled Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane is an amazing film from all standpoints, although if viewed today, it's not all that impressive. It has to be looked at from the perspective of the era in which it was made. At that point in time, no filmmaker had ever utilized a camera the way Welles and cinematographer Greg Toland did. My problem is that I just don't have the time to relate everything about this movie that makes it so amazing. I can't tell you this, though. As everyone knows, Citizen Kane was based loosely, very loosely, on the life of William Randolph Hearst and his mistress, Marion Davies, among others. That editor, Robert Wise, who later became a famous director, deliberately damaged the newsreel footage by scraping it across concrete and other surfaces to make it look old. That the release of the film was more or less sabotaged by an enraged William Randolph Hearst, although reports on this vary. According to some sources, Hearst actually enjoyed the film, but his harpy gossip columnist, Luella Parsons, saw it as an unforgivable slight to her boss and sabotaged the release herself. There's an interesting story about Lulu's relationship with Hearst and how exactly she got her lifetime position as the Hearst newspaper chain's gossip columnist, but that's another story. There's another interesting story that I can't tell on the air, and that story is where co-screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz got the name Rosebud and what it really was. I can tell you this. It was something that could be ridden, so to speak, but it definitely wasn't a sled. Edward G. Robinson was born Emanuel Goldberg on December 12, 1893 in Bucharest, Romania. He appeared in 112 movies during his long career, playing everything from gangsters to doctors. His family moved to America when he was 10 and settled in New York's Lower East Side, and he got into acting while attending City College. After receiving a scholarship from the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, he began to work in stock in 1913 and made his Broadway debut 2 years later. His first screen appearance was in 1916's Arms and the Woman, but he didn't start acting regularly in the film until the advent of sound. 1930's Little Caesar is the film that brought him to the attention of the American public, and from there his star shot into the stratosphere. He appeared in the Billy Wilder classic Double Indemnity as the insurance investigator that runs murderer Fred McMurray to ground. Despite his tough guy screen persona, Robinson was, in real life, a very cultured and gentle man, loved by all of his directors and co-stars. He was an insatiable collector, starting with cigar bands in his youth and moving up to collecting art in his adult years. He was accused of being a communist and was blacklisted for a brief time in the 50s, but found work on the stage. He appeared as Johnny Rocco in one of my favorite movies, 1948's Key Largo. His last film appearance was as Saul Roth in 1973's Soylent Green with Charlton Heston. Edward G. Robinson died of cancer on January 26, 1973, in Hollywood, California. Loretta Young was born Gretchen Michaelia Young on January 6, 1913 in Salt Lake City, Utah. She appeared in 100 movies and 5 television shows over the course of her career. That career started for her in 1928 when she appeared in The Magnificent Flirt. At 16, she married her co-star, Grant Withers, who appeared with her in 1930's The Second Floor Mystery, and they were divorced less than a year later. She grew into a stunningly beautiful woman and moved from First National Studios to Fox, where she became a leading lady. In 1935, she appeared in Call of the Wild with Clark Gable. Now, I have an aside here. This is just a personal observation, so take it for what it's worth. I've examined a number of web bios on Loretta Young, and she seems to be a very popular lady for both her beauty and apparently her piety. Her following appears very dedicated, but they tend to gloss over some of the less savory aspects of her life. She was known variously as Saint Loretta or Attila the Nun, depending on who was doing the speaking. In his autobiography, William Wellman, the director of Call of the Wild, wrote about the off-screen romance between Gable and Young. He said, "We had trouble on Call of the Wild, big trouble. Gable was attending to business, not the business of making pictures. He was paying a lot of attention to monkey business." After the movie was finished, it was announced that Miss Young would retire from the screen for a full year for, quote, reasons of health, unquote. She returned to work a year later, and on May 11th, 1937, she managed to adopt a little girl, despite California rulings prohibiting the adoption of a child by a single person. As Kenneth Anger tells it in his excellent Hollywood Babylon 2, she claimed she had fallen in love with a child when she first noticed her decorating a Christmas tree in a San Diego orphanage. At the time of her adoption, little Judy was 23 months old. She was born a few months after production on Call of the Wild ended, during the period of Loretta's retirement. When the film's director was queried, Wellman replied, All I know is that Loretta and Clark were very friendly during the picture, and it was very cold up there. When the film was finished, she disappeared for a while and later showed up with a daughter with the biggest ears I ever saw, except on an elephant. After her second marriage, she began to exhibit signs of extreme Catholic piety. She had holy water fonts installed on either side of the doors of her home and posed for Blessed Virgin-like photos taken by her husband, ad executive Thomas Lewis. She began to develop a holier-than-thou attitude on the set, refusing to kiss Victor Jory during the production of The Devil's in Love because she was a star and he wasn't. On her TV subs of the Loretta Young Show, she installed a swear box on the set, fining crew and cast members she overheard using profanity. I've been on a number of sets in my time, and that thing had to be packed to the gills with cash. Now, the following story is one I've heard from a number of sources, and as I've heard it, it was either a crew member or a Broadway star that did this. When the person in question cursed mildly on the set, Loretta marched up to him and told him he was being fined 50 cents for swearing. The man in question pulled a bill out of his pocket and thrust it at her, saying, "Here's $10. Now fuck off, Loretta!" She won a Best Actress Oscar for her performance in 1947's The Farmer's Daughter, and also appeared in another interesting movie the same year, The Bishop's Wife. Loretta Young died of ovarian cancer on August 12, 2000 in her Los Angeles, California home. In her posthumously published autobiography, she admitted that Judy Lewis was her biological daughter by Clark Gable. Perhaps one of the reasons this movie is considered minor Welles is because after the film was turned into the studio by Welles, it was recut and 20 minutes of the film, which Welles described as everything which is interesting, were excised. The cut scenes are considered lost, so the odds of seeing the film as Orson Welles intended it are right around zero. Even still, it's an interesting movie and is worth watching. One other thing. Welles' original casting choice for Inspector Wilson, the part played by Edward G. Robinson, was Agnes Moorehead. So right now, sit back, relax, and enjoy The Stranger, right here on Cleveland Classic Cinema.